Being a Victorian woman was incredibly hard. We often characterise the Victorian times as a time when misogyny was especially rampant, and obviously misogyny happened before 1837 and after 1901, but in this time period it was especially bad. The sole religion of England at the time was Christianity, and there was a very strong belief in original sin, that being that we were all born into sin and we have to do things in life to try and get us to heaven. This, in combination with the fact everyone believed in the story of Adam and Eve, wherein Eve gave into the temptation of the apple, meant that women were fighting two battles from birth. They were fighting the fact that they were born into sin, like every other human, and they were fighting the fact that they were born into temptation and, crucially, could do something about it. It was a common belief that men were morally weaker than women, and therefore couldn't do anything about their temptation and were allowed to purge their sins in life, but women were morally stronger and could do something about this temptation, leading to a huge disparity in the lives of men and women. Even the way that women acted had to be really repressive. They had to be the embodiment of chastity, restraint and purity throughout their whole lives, and they had to hold themselves, their sisters, their daughters and even strangers to the same standard. Even the way women looked had to allude to the fact that she didn't give in to temptation. That's why women wore corsets, because it gave them a slim silhouette and suggested she didn't give in to the temptation of food. Even the most powerful woman in the world at the time, Queen Victoria, fell victim of this powerful beauty standard. Standing at 4'11", she was incredibly stout, and as a young monarch and as a queen, she wanted to assert her dominance as ruler, so she had to be the embodiment of restraint and purity and chastity as a queen. The discussion of morals and the human nature of Victorian people impacted the roles in society that men and women had to play. As I said before, women were seen to be morally stronger but physically weaker, so the best place for them was seen to be in the household. In the household, they could not only counter the taint that their husbands brought home, but they could impart their good morals onto the next generation. This role was dubbed the angel of the house. The angel of the house was actually used as an excuse not to give women the vote, because their influence is seen to be in the household, and it wasn't needed in a place like politics. The role that women were destined for influenced their education as well. Yes, upper class women did have a thorough education, but it was softened by the fact that they did typically feminine subjects, such as linguistics or the arts, and were trained thoroughly in etiquette. If a woman was seen to be too enthusiastic about intelligence or intellectual conversation, or was interested in science subjects, she was dubbed the blue stocking. This fear of being too intelligent actually led to a lot of families not letting their intelligent daughters into Oxford and Cambridge even after they opened their doors for them, for the fear of being unmarriable. The fear of being unmarriable plagued all Victorian families and all Victorian women, because at the end of the day, marriage was survival for women. Society inhibited women from making their own living. They couldn't even open their own bank accounts, so the only way women could move on from their husband, from their families, was to get married. But after a woman was married, she was the property of her husband. So was her wealth, so were all of her assets, and so were her children. So a woman was stuck. Many things that would be grounds for divorce nowadays simply weren't grounds for divorce in the Victorian times, such as domestic violence or adultery. Adultery was a crime for women, but it wasn't for men, because again it comes back to the morals of men and women and the difference between them. Even if by some miracle a woman did get divorced from her husband, the life after divorce would be incredibly hard, because the property that she had going into marriage would still be the property of her husband, and the children that she had would be the property of her husband. So there was no way for a woman to make a good, respectable living in society. So women were stuck, essentially. The reason why adultery was a crime for women and not for men was because, yes, men were morally weaker, but it was commonplace to believe that women simply didn't have sexual desires, so why would they need extramarital affairs? This was a viewpoint that Dr. William Acton, a gynaecologist in the Victorian times, came to. Women were famously told to lie back and think of England on their wedding night, because sex was seen to be an unfortunate step towards procreation. But this viewpoint was actually discredited by Queen Victoria herself. Queen Victoria famously wrote very detailed diary entries, and this included the relationship that she had towards Albert and the feelings she felt for him. Conversely, men were seen to have sexual desires because they were morally weaker than women. So that's why the prostitution industry boomed so much in the Victorian times. Almost 3% of the population in the Victorian times were prostitutes. This was around 80,000 women. Although prostitutes were shunned from society, there was no effort to make it illegal in England, because it was quite common to believe that it was a necessary evil to keep the pure, the pure being upper class women. Although sex was a taboo topic and men had to go to the back streets of the East End to purge their sins, the rise of medicine came the rise of the inevitable discussion of sexual health and therefore the discussion of sex. And it could be argued that this initial discussion of sex that previously hardly ever happened and was shrouded with innuendos and metaphors started the sexual revolution movement that started in the 1970s. This discussion of sex also started off the women's movement. Feminism wasn't something in the Victorian times, and it was never labelled that, the women's movement or feminism in the Victorian times, but there were efforts for women's rights. We can also look across the pond in America at efforts for women's rights, and these theories do apply to Victorian England. For example, famous feminist author who was American, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who wrote the novel The Yellow Wallpaper, argued for communal living for people so they could share the burden of childcare, and women weren't tied down by the fact that they had to be this role of the mother. She also argued for economic independence, which would have given women a way out of marriage. If women had the means to make a living for themselves, then they wouldn't be stuck in abusive relationships, and therefore they'd be free. However, everything I've discussed currently only applies to upper class women. Working class women had to fight two pressures: the societal pressure that upper class women used to face, and the economic factors. They had to be the angel of a house that was essentially crumbling away around them. Overcrowding was a huge problem in the Victorian times. There were reports in London of some 10-room houses that had 90 people in them, and they were rotting away in the walls. The idea of respectability came from cleanliness for Victorian women, especially working class women. Working class women used to spend whole days doing laundry and scrubbing out the bane of a Victorian working class woman's existence: coal stains. Coal stains happened from the smog in the air from the Industrial Revolution in the Victorian times, and the stains that their husbands brought home on their clothes. They'd be scrubbing curtains, walls and windows, and even doorsteps, as this was a sign of respectability. Women used to try and find places in factories to try and support their families, such as in textile factories, but the fact was women weren't paid the same as men, so it was an incredibly hard life for Victorian working class women. Because the life of a Victorian working class woman was so hard to uphold, many women fell into the path of prostitution. The three most reported professions for prostitution for falling into it were factory workers, who often worked late with men and were corrupted sometimes and were coerced into sexual acts by them; seamstresses, who were overworked and underpaid and sometimes couldn't find jobs, so prostitution was a means of survival; and servants, who were sometimes coerced or seduced by their masters to perform sexual acts with them. And unfortunately for these women, once their virtue was lost, so was the prospect of marriage, so they were essentially stuck in this way of life. However, some women did choose this way of life, a very small minority, because at the end of the day it had a small amount of hours and did pay very well. So overall, prostitution was a result of the disparity between working class and upper class, this huge class divide, and the lack of opportunities for working class women. And we can't ignore the way that working class women were almost taken advantage of by upper class men to keep the pure, as I've said before, that statement, keep upper class women pure. And they were used as a tool, basically, to keep this society propped up.